Thanks a lot for coming here. It's a really important gathering. You know, for a long time in this country, we've been focused on emissions of fossil fuels and controlling those emissions and eliminating them and working our way away from dependence on fossil fuels. And in my career, I've been lucky to be involved in more than just agriculture. In the 1990s, I was on the Montreal Protocol Committee for ozone depleting substances. I was on the technical part of the committee. And while we were really focused on eliminating CFCs and bromides and HCFCs in the Montreal Protocol, many of the atmospheric scientists that I worked with were concerned about climate change in the 90s. And, you know, we didn't really get to that point until, you know, the early 2000s, where we were starting to panic about climate change. And as a country, when we talk about climate change, we've been focused, like I say, on fossil fuel emissions. And only in this last meeting in Morocco of the COP meetings over climate change, were there any meetings about agriculture. So for the last 25 years, we haven't really been concerned about agriculture. But as farmers, we're constantly monitoring the weather, and by the early 90s, we knew that things were changing, and they were changing rapidly because weather patterns that we were used to no longer were patterns. Everything started to be much more chaotic. And then in around 2004, I stumbled onto some articles by colleagues from the Montreal Protocol about climate change. They started writing about climate change and realizing that this was something that we all needed to look at more closely. And so I devoured most of the literature that they had, and in 2007 I started giving lectures around the country on climate change, and people said, why are you talking about agriculture? The problem is fossil fuel. And I said, well, first of all, agriculture in our country is fossil fueled. I mean, you have 25 million tractors in this country, and 10 million combines, and so fossil fuel is the name of the game, whether you're driving a motorcycle out to check your crops or whether you're driving the biggest tractor with 16 wheels. And so I started talking to people, and one of the things I found early on in my agriculture is that every piece of ground that I took over was deficient in soil organic matter. And soil organic matter is about 58% carbon on average. And so soil organic matter is a major source of carbon in our soils. And then, we started looking at, well, how could we change that? And so, we used a lot of compost and cover crops, and cover crops are like fertilizer crops that you use after the cash crop to try to get fertility, but also to keep the ground covered. Because one of our biggest losses of carbon is erosion. And if the ground isn't covered, you have wind erosion and you have water erosion. And we found that we could dramatically increase carbon relatively quickly. Like in 4 years on light soils in the San Joaquin Valley, we increased organic matter by up to 3 and 4%. And that's starting at less than 1%. And we did the same thing in Vermont. We had light ground along the Connecticut River, and we increased the organic matter up to 3 to 4%. But we lose some every year, so we had to add a cover crop every year. And then in 2013, we decided, look, let's see if we can figure out how to do no-till in vegetables, because people were doing no-till in corn and soybeans and cotton, but they were doing it with chemicals. and we're organic farmers, and so we wanted to figure out how we could do it without chemicals. Well, the University of Vermont bought us a roller crimper, which kills the cover crop, and so we used that first in 2012, I think it was, and then in 2013 we got really serious with it. And while we killed most of the cover crop didn't provide enough cover to really suppress all the weeds. And so we were planting about 110 pounds of rye at the time, and we upped it to 200 pounds per acre. And that suppressed the weeds. And in those areas where we couldn't suppress the weeds, we have a fairly large farm. We have 13 greenhouses, so we have a lot of leftover plastic. And we started using that plastic to solarize some of the weeds in those spots where we couldn't kill the cover crop with the roller crimper. And then Dr. Bronner's Magic Soap bought us a no-till transplanter. We tried doing no-till with just our regular tools. That was a joke. And so Dr. Bronner bought us a no-till transplanter, and then he bought us a no-till grain drill. And that dramatically changed things. This last year, we got really good crops of corn, broccoli, kale, and squash with no weeds, no weeding, and with good yields. I mean, we were a little bit worried about not having enough nitrogen, but we were able to pull it off. So we really feel like there is an opportunity for farmers to dramatically increase carbon by keeping that soil covered and by putting on cover crops that enable us to suppress weeds. So we put no labor hardly into that crop except planting it and harvesting it, whereas usually most of our labor is weeding in an organic system. So we felt really good about that. The other thing that we decided in 2013 is that we needed a parallel movement to the 350.org movement. And that 350.org movement, again, has been focused mostly on controlling emissions and getting rid of fossil fuels. But we felt like, well, that is a great thing, but that's like closing the hole in the boat. When you have a hole in the boat and the boat's about to sink, you know, what they're trying to do is close the hole so that we don't get any more water in the hole, in this case, so we don't get any more carbon into the atmosphere, right? But we need a second movement, and that second movement is a fix-it movement. You know, how are we going to get the carbon out of the atmosphere and back into the soil where it's valuable? I mean, it's a problem in the atmosphere and the oceans, and we don't talk about the oceans very much in terms of climate change, but we definitely need to. So how do we get that carbon out of the oceans and the atmosphere and back into the soil? And that's what we're focused on in Regeneration International, Regeneration Vermont, and in the programs that we're trying to create. We're trying to look at programs for how farmers can become the solution to climate change problems. Because so many of us feel like desperate about climate change. I mean, what's the solution? I mean, a lot of these chemicals that are up there, especially carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, are going to be up there for almost 500 years. So if we don't get them out of there, we're in deep trouble. And so what you do as in the legislature and in the Senate is very important, because we really need a lot of help redirecting this ship, not just bailing it out, but really, we really need to have your help, and we really need you to change your food system. I mean, right now, most of the food that we eat is causing climate change. It's not fixing climate change. So we're advocating people to switch to an organic diet, grow a garden in your backyard, take out your lawn, put in a garden. I mean, it's all fixable. We did this during the Second World War. I'm 80 years old. And so I lived through that period where most of our food came out of our backyards. And so you're a big part of fixing this, and you're a big part of our hope. So thanks a lot.